Hello, it's your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Telegram and Facebook and Twitter, and support me on Loco, Subscribestar, and Buy Me a Coffee. Now, today's episode 80 of the Casual Stream, is Asimov, the Foundation, and the Fall of Empires. So, I recently reread the Trilogy of the Foundation by Isaac Asimov, which is Foundation, the second forward, the Foundation and Empire, and then the second Foundation. Now, I first read those when I was a kid, maybe around 14. And at the time, I didn't really remember enjoying them all that much. There was a lot of meta issues that I wasn't really able to track at the time, in part because I was too young. But as recently, like about a year and a half ago, I realized that there were a lot of big ideas in the Foundation, and that Asimov himself had been inspired by Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And there were themes, of course, like Galactic and Imperial decline and how that might be dealt with in one, a intergalactic sense, but also two, how might one deal with the coming Dark Age? Okay, that's the main theme of the whole story. And I reread it over the last year, and it was really, really good. And there was a lot of themes that I was now better able to appreciate, being older and more familiar with history at the time. And I thought to myself, well, there's a lot of interesting things that Asimov has to say. There's interesting ways in which the historical account of the fall of the Roman Empire and other empires in general falls into this. And when you're and then how do you identify if you're in that stage of a civilization's history? And then also, how do you evaluate what's important and what's not important? What's really worth fighting for at this stage and what's not? So the interesting thing that I thought about here is there must be something like the Foundation at the fall of some empires. Well, some empires fall and leave nothing to remind us of them. Their knowledge is lost. Others leave remnants from which a new world can be built. I assume this done in a rather spontaneous and unplanned fashion rather than a deliberate and planned fashion in Asimov's telling. A good example, the medieval Irish monks who preserved classical knowledge. While the writings from the 5th to the 9th centuries are scarce, the real reason for the eponymous Dark Ages, one must concede that the monks had motivations for their actions, and very likely motivations is the preservation of truth for the future, a future they knew they will never see. Which is interesting here, right? Because if you look at the Foundation, and that's created by Hari Seldon and the men that continue it, there were two, one on, and of course there'll be some spoilers here, so if you haven't read it, don't keep, unless you don't care, keep watching. Read it. But the idea is that there was one Foundation which majored in material sciences, and then there was one which was psychology. The first Foundation is one we follow as we read the story, and the goal was to shorten the Dark Age from 30,000 years to 1,000 years, since the Empire couldn't be saved. And the way that we're led to believe that's going to happen is by having these foundations created, and they'll be growing as the Empire declines. And so the one we follow is at Terminus, at the very edge of the galactic rim. Now, it's kind of interesting, right? While this was an intentional plan, a plan that Hari Seldon knew he wouldn't live to see the conclusion of, right? If we look at the Irish in the Middle Ages, they're at the fringe of the Roman Empire, or actually not even within the Roman Empire. Ireland itself, classically called Hibernia, was not ever a part of the Roman Empire. And we see here that there's essentially at the fringes of a civilization, as it's falling, these sort of literati or intellectuals who preserve the ideas and principles from destruction, so that at some point in the future, people will be able to use it. And this is very interesting because it's a way of thinking that most people are not really capable of exercising anymore. There's a saying that is, someone plants trees they will never sit under the shade of, but their grandchildren and beyond, right? And partly why the modern West is so badly off is that we don't think like that anymore. Now, I don't know, from the historical record, I don't think we can show one way or the other. If there was a concerted effort by a central organization like the Foundation, maybe the Roman Catholic Church, to preserve all these texts, they were probably done more in ad hoc, spontaneous fashion. But nonetheless, there's a similar pattern here, that this intellectual group goes to the far reaches of the empire in order to preserve these texts. Now, we're going to switch to the Romans here, the actual Roman Empire collapse. While the date of the death of the Romano-British missionary Patrick is disputed, one popular date is 460 AD. For my purposes, let us use this date of 460. In the imperial capital of Rome, Majorian, the last strong emperor, was locked in a struggle with Ricimer, a Romano-German master of the horse and foot, in the struggle for the empire. Majorian was preparing to attack the Vandals in Africa when his Spanish fleet was attacked by Vandal fireships and or Ricimer's saboteurs, depending on the telling of the story, and his bid to restore Africa ended. The reason being because Rome itself was fed by grain shipments from Africa, which were disrupted by the Vandal conquest. He was later killed by Ricimer. Two later emperors, Liberius Severus and Anthemius, overlapped with Ricimer. The former died of natural causes, and the latter was overthrown in a civil war, leading to the third sack of Rome in the 5th century in 472. By all standards of the time, the real show was in Rome, and with Ricimer, the Vandals, and the emperors, right? That's where everybody would be watching, and if they made a movie or TV show about this period, that's what people would focus on. The battle for the imperial purple. And yet, by 500 AD, it was all a distant memory and amounted to nothing. The work of Patrick at the fringes of the empire would lay the foundation for the Carolingian Renaissance. Who is in fact more important, the missionary or the imperial court? The question answers itself. So the Carolingian Renaissance, which was the first attempt at bringing back these classical sources by a unified political system, however briefly it lasted under Charlemagne, was made possible by Anglo-Saxon scholars from Northumbria and then Gaelic scholars from Ireland, all of which were a part of this broader effort that Patrick started 400 years before this takes place. And this creates an interesting dilemma, right? Because on the one hand, when an empire is dying, you think that the capital is the most important thing. And this thing comes up throughout the foundation as well. Everybody's focused on Trantor, the capital, and focused on what's going on there. But what we, the reader, know because of what we're told by Hari Seldon and the Encyclopedia Galactica, which has each chapter heading has an entry from the Encyclopedia Galactica, is that this isn't really that important because the empire is in terminal decline. The real future lies somewhere else. And so this is where we're getting at now in the modern United States, right? Most people are focusing on Washington, D.C., quote unquote, the imperial capital, so to speak, and especially those on the right. And I think this is a mistake. I think that if we look at the 5th century, it would have been a mistake, though an understandable one, for people to look at Ricimer and Majorian and the infighting within the Western Roman Empire, which ultimately signified very little in light of the fact that it collapsed. Whereas the work of Patrick, which would have been seen as at the fringe of the known world and not very important, ended up having tremendous more importance than these issues. And so the question that we're beginning to ask here is, how do you determine what is the actual long-term trend, okay, i.e. falling empire or not, and then also what kinds of actions are the kinds of actions that you can take that would maximize your impact down the centuries after that empire falls. So, for example, when one is looking at any process, say water turning from a liquid into a solid, this process takes place through various stages. So if one sees, for example, the water molecule slowing down, this indicates they are cooling and marks some stage of the transition to ice. Well, it might. A careful observer would be well within his rights to argue at the outset that this process is underway and plan accordingly. So if you have a multi-stage process, right, and you're aware of it, and then you're aware that it occurs in nature and human social structures, and then you see it, especially if it's a process that takes a very long time, unless you have some other valid explanation, you're well within your rights to assume that this is what's happening. And I ask, what more do we have to see to know that the Western world and America are collapsing? Literally every earmark is there: degeneracy, corruption, imperial hubris and tone deafness. Literally everything that we see as the mark of a collapsing society is going on now. And there's no indication that it's going to turn around. what more needs to be shown that the empire is falling? The sack of its capital is one thing. So in 410, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome and set off a panic about the empire's demise. This stimulated Augustine to write the City of God to tell people that the fall of the empire did not mean the end of the world. I think many people still refuse to see that the imperial core of DC, for example, is a meaningless energy sink. Men wasted energy in seeking control of the imperial purple in the 5th century and lost everything. The barbarian wasteland of Ireland was the real future of Europe. The dissident right is repeating the mistake of the religious right with Bush 2 and the normie right with Trump. Getting our guy in doesn't do anything. It's like Rees-Mogg circular firing squad. We need a Patrick and a new Ireland, or a Hari Seldon and a foundation. So what does this mean? Well, in part, the reason why nothing changes is in the first chapter of the foundation, where Hari Seldon is being interrogated by an imperial judge. And they arrest him and say that he's, sowing dissent to the empire, predicting its demise. He says, could this be averted? Could this be changed? And Seldon says nothing's inevitable. If there was another force greater than the force he was tracking with psychohistory to discern the collapse, then yeah, you could turn it around. But he said no such force exists. And I argue that no such force currently exists. So even if there were some theoretical way in which this could be arrested, there's no actual way. And in fact, the inertia of prior generations becomes a straitjacket by which your actions. So if we look at a choice matrix of possible actions a leader could take, as the people that come before make actions, they preclude choices from leaders that come in the future. So for example, right, Putin's Russia. Because of what 100 years before, what the czars did, getting Russia involved into World War I, and then miffing that up and losing, and then creating the scope for the Bolshevik Revolution. From 1913 to 1924, something like 10 to 15 million Russians died. And then you had the purges of Stalin, and then you had World War II. So all of these choices create massive pressures on Russia today, primarily demographic. And there's not a whole lot Putin can do. There are lots of actions and choices that Putin could have chosen, which are now off the table because of men who lived far, far before him and made really bad decisions. We're like that now in the West. And so the real question is, what choices are left open to us practically rather than theoretically? That's a question that isn't being asked but should be. Now, when you are transitioning from one age to the next, here's what I view as a helpful metaphor. Imagine two hollow cones with no base, tip to tip. The cone on the left represents the current age, and the cone on the right, the new age to come. As you move toward the point of the cone, space becomes constrained, and at some point you cross the point of no return and enter into the new state. Those who fail to act in accordance with the new age being born will be destroyed, like Rees-Mogg and Majorian. Furthermore, using a three-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system to plot some destination in the right-hand cone while still living in the left-hand cone is very hard, but not impossible, as the iris showed us. That is our task for today. The forces of history will push us right up to the point of one cone into the open expanse of the next. Will you survive the transition? Okay, this is why this is extremely, extremely difficult, because you first have to have an understanding of the major forces at work in the age that we're living in now. You also have to have at least some good guesses based on inferences of so we're in an age of transition, so there are transitional forces. There will be forces that are at work in the future to a much greater degree than are today, and there'll be forces acting today that will be completely absent in the future. Determining which of those two, differentiating between those two, is going to be very challenging. But if you can, and then paint a general picture of what's to come, you can then make a plan. But you have to be able to manage all of these variables. Now, again, the genius of psychohistory is that you have to deal with very big concepts. The big concept here were large aggregations of humans acting. I'm saying we can choose even larger, more abstract principles than just aggregates of humans, though that's what you can do. Because if you view humans in aggregate, you can say, okay, well, there's only really so many choices they're going to make. True, but also you need to know the constraints of the environment that they're in. And, for example, the future will be a much lower energy state. So if you were proposing solutions, for example, that are contingent upon high energy levels, you will fail because you will not be able to navigate to the other side. But that's the question we need to ask. That's the challenge we need to address. So one good example of how this thinking might be applied to practical considerations today is the DR's banking on the rise of a Red Caesar figure, which is likely a product of Yaki's Imperium, but I frankly see no example of a Red Caesar in the offing. I mean, first of all, where's he going to come from? And that's the point. Like, I don't think anybody, because right, I mean, someone like Franco comes from the military, so like a Cromwell comes from the military, and these are like hardcore guys. Like, there's nobody in the military today like that. Not in leadership positions. They're all basically paper-pushing bureaucrats, not men of action like Patton or MacArthur 80 years ago. Such men were sort of weeded out from the situation. The other thing is, I define red because the people in leadership positions that are seen as somewhat, pro right wing, well, maybe a Donald Trump or maybe Elon Musk, they're not really right wing. It's just like they're about as far right as the establishment can go, but that doesn't make them right wing per se. So that's one thing. But I also argue this is a derailment. It's like, sending all your legions to go fight in Rome in the 5th century while it's falling. All of that energy just got expended when the empire fell, and it was wasted. It was gone. You don't get it back. So that's one problem. The real issue here, though, is the problems we face are fundamentally not the kind of problems we can solve with a political despot. Let's engage with a thought experiment. Let's say that the Red Caesar drives out the Blue Tribe and gets in all the base right-wing anons to management positions, and we turn it all around for the U.S. Well, guess what? We still have collapsed. The energy crisis is still coming. I don't believe the Green Lobby is stopping the U.S. from doing the things necessary to produce energy. So, for example, you'll hear people say, well, if we just went all nuclear and carefully rationed oil for like earth movers and converted to rail to powered by nuclear electricity, it'd all work. Okay, why doesn't Russia and China do that? They don't have a Green Lobby. So what this indicates to me is that there are limitations on the technology that are not primarily political. What that might be, I don't know. But Russia and China don't have a Green Lobby, so why aren't they doing this? They're not. So, I mean, it could also just be that, the potential for one meltdown is just so catastrophically disastrous. Would you do it? I mean, it's that famous saying, if you have 100 Skittles and one is poison, would you take the risk? Well, the answer is no. So that could also be the case. Now, even if we had maximal pro-natalist policies tomorrow, we'd still have a population crash. The global economy is in tatters since COVID, and increasingly we now have, actual attacks on the supply chain system like the Houthis in the Red Sea. So unless the United States went full isolationist and autarkic, which it could, a Red Caesar sending his legions around the world to impose global order will not work better than Bush, Obama, or Biden. So there's that. And also, I suppose you could say with the modern technological system, you could pursue a policy of automation of Japan rather than immigration. But again, that still doesn't solve the population crisis per se. And, you'd still have the population crash because of the people that weren't born in prior generations. There's one pressure is that many people are being forced to live in urban areas, and that's going to reduce, even without technology, that's going to reduce fertility. And one of the policies of the Eastern Roman Empire throughout the Middle Ages was in order to populate the rural areas after invasion or war or famine or whatever, would basically just forcibly relocate urbanites to these rural areas because they knew that they would start having children again. But there's something with the way that we relate to technology itself that reduces fertility in an extremely negative fashion. And none of this is immediately addressed. Now, someone might say, well, right, but we've at least created the conditions where it could be addressed. And like, well, maybe. It's not immediately apparent to me that that's the case. We have deep moral, environmental, and philosophical problems that are just not solvable by a changing of the guard. It didn't matter who wore the purple from 410 to 476. The Roman system was circling the drain. There's another knock-on effect problem with the Red Caesar too. So, for example, there are people, quote, on the left who have, of course, been thrown out as the revolution keeps going further and further extreme. They may not be, quote unquote, fully right-wing, but they're not really in the left-wing coalition anymore. And the risk that I see with a lot of people on the right is that they'll just be driven right back. Because it's like, it's not great where I came from, but if, whatever this scenario entails means I'm just going to get a free helicopter ride, a la Hapa, then I don't think so. I'll go back or do something else. And that just seems like a waste of future potential. And furthermore, you don't need to make more enemies than you have to. That's a basic principle already. You don't need to make more enemies than you have to. So that's a big one here. And I think what we need is a mental shift of thought. Because part of the problem already is a way of thinking. That's the actual problem. And arguably that was the root cause of what was wrong in the 5th century. Because if you have a train of thought, not just in your own mind over decades and decades and decades, but in the lives of a nation over centuries, it builds up an inertia, just like choices. And this inertia becomes irresistible until it destroys itself and creates a clean slate for new ideas to develop. And so the idea that we've been developing with now is technique and technology. And it's all used up. There are no solutions because the system itself is the problem. And nobody can think outside of the system because we're so lost in the sauce. So Carlyle warned of this, and I quote from his 1829 essay, Signs of the Times, "For the same habit regulates not our modes of action alone, but our modes of thought and feeling. Men are grown mechanical in head and heart as well as in hand." So for example, you often hear DR Anons talking about the system as if it were a car, swapping out parts here and there, or just getting a new one. This way of thinking is the problem itself. Human social order is not a machine to have parts replaced or swapped for some other machine. It is something else entirely, or it's an organism, right? Organism is the word not only that we should use, but it was the word that was historically used. So for example, corporation today means something different than it meant in the past, because a corporate body would have been like a guild or a political organization in antiquity in the Middle Ages, because it represented a coming together, a common principle, a common set of values, a common stock. So a good example of this would be Coriolanus, the Shakespeare play Coriolanus, where we see the idea of this analogy of treating this thing as an organism rather than something else. Let's see if I can find. Here we go. Entire play. Here we go. Okay. Well, yeah, here we go. So this is Meaningless, who's talking about the Roman state as if it were a body. Meaningless, either you must confess yourselves wondrous, malicious, or be accused of folly. I shall tell you a pretty tale. It may be you have heard it, but since it serves my purpose, I will venture to state it a little more. Meaningless, there was a time when all the body's members rebelled against the belly, thus accused it, that only like a gulf it did remain. I, the midst of thy body, idle and unactive, still cupboarding the vinad, never bearing, like labor without the rest. Where the other instruments did see and hear, devise, instruct, walk, and feel, and mutually participate, did minister unto the appetite and affection common of the whole body, the belly answered. Second citizen, well, what did the answer made the belly? Meaningless, sir, I shall tell you with a kind of smile, which never came from the lungs, but even thus, for you look, I may make the belly smile as well as speak, it tauntingly replied. To the discontented members, the mutinous parts that envied his receipt. Even so, most fitly, as you malign our senator, for that you are not so much. Okay, there's some back and forth. Back to the story. Menenius, note me, this good friend, your most grave belly was deliberate, not rash like his accusers, and thus answered. True, it is my incorporate friends. There you go. Incorporate. That's the key word here, quoth he. That I receive the general food at first, which you do live upon, and fit it is, because I am the storehouse and the shop of the whole body. But if you do remember, I send it through the rivers of your blood, even to the core, the heart, to the seat of the brain, and through the cranks and offices of man, the strongest nerves and small inferior veins, for me receive that natural competency whereby they live. And though they are at once, you, my good friends, this says the belly mark me. Right, and that's an analogy that I give because it represents what is an incorporate body. And so there's actually embedded in this a few things that are wrong. The first one is, so what makes a living organism different than a machine? Well, it grows. It grows on its own, right? A machine has to be constructed. It has to be added to or taken away from, and also has to be managed, right? You have to turn it on, turn it off. You have to watch it. You have to take care of it. Whereas, a organism like a man or an animal is truly autonomous, and then just sort of operates under its own steam. And so there's a sort of category mistake in understanding what a social body is. And a lot of the problems we're dealing with, mental health issues, poverty, all these other things are really the result of treating people as fungible cogs in a machine and not as actually part of a living organism. The other thing that's important about this is that it's incorporate. It's common. The belly eating the food, distributing it through the blood is a representation of the state or the government, which takes taxes and then distributes it throughout for the, quote, common good. Well, we don't have any concept of the common good anymore. We just have private goods where people just hoard their little stashes until they die, and then the stashes go to the bank or the government. So, woohoo. It's literally nothing. It was all pointless. And again, there's no future, right? It just ends with the bank. It ends with the government. And so this way of thinking is the problem. That has to change. It has to stop. And then of course, the retort might be, well, if we don't play this game and play with these tools, then the problem is, how do we win? The other guys are so stacked against us. Well, go to Carlyle again. Same essay, The Sign of the Times. We figure society is a machine, and that mind is opposed to mind as body is to body, whereby 2 or at most 10 little minds must be stronger than one great mind. Notable absurdity, for the plain truth, very plain, we think, is that minds are opposed to minds in quite a different way. And one man that has a higher wisdom, a hereto unknown spiritual truth in him, is stronger not than 10 men that have it not, or than 10,000, but than all men that have it not, and stands among them with quite ethereal angelic power, as with a sword out of heaven's own armory, sky-tempered, which no buckler and no tower of brass will finally withstand. Now, not to go on a whole sidetrack about neo-reactionaries and Moldbug, but for all the talk of Carlyle in the DR, nobody's read him. Nobody thinks like this. This way of thinking is foreign to almost everybody that is talking about these issues on the right, especially those that mention Carlyle. What they're doing is they're little tinkerers, like, gnomes in a video game or a card game, just tinkering around, trying to min-max the solution so that we can actually win. But the problem is the system that they're min-maxing in is the problem. And limiting their thoughts to everything within that system is the problem. And so what's going to happen is there's going to be an ever-shrinking pool of energy, for example, which leads to ever-limiting scopes of action. Because the law of diminishing returns, everybody just seems to think for their pet little thing, it doesn't hold. It doesn't hold for the application of force. It doesn't hold for technological innovation. It doesn't hold for financial growth. It doesn't hold for an engineer solving a problem, even though the problem isn't an engineering one. Well, No, there are going to be limits. And when a system is dying, everything that used to work either stops working entirely or just doesn't really work anymore. Hence the law of diminishing returns. For every unit you put in, you get less back. It's just not worthwhile anymore. You need something else. But that's where it comes to this deep spiritual truth. If someone doesn't have it, well, you're kind of SOL. Unless, of course, you can find someone who does have it. Now, in light of last week's discussion about Watership Down, the deep magic, and I guess what we'll call the deepest magic, this is actually how you transition from one age to the next, because both the deep magic, which is referenced in the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is what the White Witch knew, and then the deepest magic, which is what Aslan knew, stand over and above the system that we're living in now and the system that is being born on the other side. And we know that those are always in place. Always in place. So anybody who wants to build a solution or a plan to get from here to the other side, maybe not in our lifetimes, maybe not in 100 years, but it's going to happen. If you start there and then build the solution within that framework, you've basically guaranteed success, because those rules are always operative. They never change. The only thing that does change are the contingent rules beneath them. You still need to get those right, but your margin of error, your sort of fudge factor, goes way down if you do this. And I've said this before, why do you study history? You study history because once you read all of history, not literally every book of history, but you become familiar with the sweep of it, like say a Spengler was, right? Or, in his own day in Augustine, right? The idea being that you can now see universal patterns of operation that are always at work, no matter the geography, no matter the level of technological development, no matter race, sex, or religion. But you don't know what those are until you've connected the dots of the pattern throughout history. Very few people have actually written about this, because very few people have actually familiarized themselves well enough with history to do this. But that is the fundamental solution. You have to do that. And that is, of course, what that itself doesn't create the change of mind that I'm talking about, that Carlyle's talking about, because sometimes you just need that flash of inspiration from somewhere. But this is a precondition to receive it. Without this, I'm not saying you can't receive it, but it's going to be a lot harder. Imagine this flash of inspiration being like a signal that you pick up on. Well, you didn't really build your antenna very well unless you do this, and then you will be more apt to find it, or find someone who has. And so, to put this in a more concrete term, if you have the example of the two hollow cones point to point, and you're trying to go from the left side, our current age, to the right side, the new age to come, you need to first start analyzing the universally always active principles of the deep magic and deepest magic. Start with that. Once you've determined what those are. You could also say this is lowercase p perennialism, where that's what C.S. Lewis talks about in the Tao, right? So there's that as well. Okay, now then you look at the world we live in now, the mechanical age, high energy age, and look at all the factors that are at work, which is what I've been doing for the last year and a half. Then you start looking at current trends that are currently active. There are those trends that require a higher energy state and therefore will not exist in the future. So you can eliminate them from the long-term calculation for whatever's going to be on the other side. But there are trends and patterns that will persist into a low energy state that are not only not analogous to prior human social structures, but actually are brand new because they're the effect of a technological civilization. Right? The imprint that it left on the timeline is totally unique to itself. It's sui generis. So the after effects will be sui generis. And they will be almost as difficult to predict as it was to predict the rising industrial age, even though I think Carlyle did a pretty good job given what he had. That's the task. That's what needs to be done. And That's why going all the way back to where we started with Asimov, that's the foundation. That's what we need. Now, of course, we have quote unquote foundations all over the place. So the foundation may not be a good name for it, but given it's a placeholder. It's what it represents. This is exactly what Asimov was getting at. And, his own speculative work has much to recommend it and is instructive in many ways, though I think there are some limitations and flaws, in part because he was an atheist, in part because he was pretty lost in the sauce with modern technology and had a rather utopian view of it. So that being the case, though, it is an attempt at training you to think this way. Because one of the things that I realized rereading the Foundation is this way of thinking that at least Harvey Seldon had and many of the Foundationers, that you could come up with this plan. Admittedly, it's one that has to be corrected from time to time, which is you see in the Foundation and Empire and the Second Foundation, where the Second Foundation is introduced, the psychologist. But to correct it, though, you still have to think like that. And that's what we have to do. We have to think like that. And I used to tell, over the last 22 years now, since I read it, I'm like, why aren't people doing this? Why aren't people doing this? And I realized I think like this because I read the Foundation in the first place. And while I was young and didn't necessarily put all the pieces together, going back, I can see how that has shaped my way of looking at the problem now. And in fact, that's why I think the Foundation is one of my favorite science fiction works, is that it is science fiction. There's spaceships, there's space travel, of course, but it's not like a normal science fiction. It's not pulpy like space opera. It's not like weird and mind-bending like, Dune, whatever Dune is, however you want to classify that. It has more in common with works of history or even fantasy that's just set in a science fiction setting, right? And does have, again, a rather utopian view of how technology can work. And the problem that I see, and in part why I wanted to discuss this episode in the first place, is that many on the right it's not that they refuse to think this way, as if it's something that's been on the table for a long time and they just constantly refuse to pick up the knife and the fork and eat it. It's that they don't even know it's there. To quote Donald Rumsfeld, it's an unknown for these people. But that's why we're stuck. That's why we can't get ahead. Now, for whatever reason, I think the Irish monks had that way of thinking, which is why they were doing something that would transcend the fall of the Roman Empire as a political order and last into an unknown. I mean, they would have probably been, I don't know if they would have been familiar with the Bronze Age collapse, where Babylon and Egypt fell. That's not directly referenced in the Bible. So, even though they would have been familiar with the Bible, they wouldn't necessarily have been familiar with that. And the ancient accounts that we have are from cuneiform tablets that are often only recently discovered, like the last couple of 100 years. So I don't know if they would have known the exact details of that, but the idea of an empire falling and then going to a dark age, they would have been aware of the Greek dark age after the Trojan War and then leading for like 500 years until the rebirth of the city-states. And of course, how would you preserve something between then? Well, you need a new institution. And this institution is the monastery, right? The first monasteries were around the late 3rd century. And of course, this becomes the new institution, which is the vehicle that survives state collapse, economic collapse, and continues into the future. Now, it's self-sufficient in terms of economically, though not, of course, personnel-wise. They're monks, they're celibate, so you have to bring people in. But it's this change of mind is also with a change of an institution. Now, I don't know what kind of institution you would have to have, but even the monasteries themselves were contained within the broader Roman Catholic Church. So I do think a religious institution, a religious order, is the kind of thing that could be the basis for not only this transformation of thought, and hence action, because thought precedes action. It's also necessary to build the real world infrastructure. We're not just dealing with ideas anymore. We're dealing with a physical thing that exists. So, and that which can then pursue a goal directed by whoever's in charge of it. And the goal that I'm speaking of would be to somehow transition through this bottleneck. Because again, mostly what I hear is people just be like, "Well, we're just going to write it out, guys. Just have a bunch of kids." Like that's literally the dumbest advice I ever heard. People were having kids in the 5th century. They just died because barbarian invasion, plagues, famine. Like, you got to hedge for all these other things. It's really weird, right? Because the dissonant right, granted though, this element's now gone, of the sort of like human biodiversity, the sort of fascist element, were favored case selection, where you just have a few offspring and invest heavily in them. Now we've resorted to our selection, where we just have as many as possible. But the thing is, they're just going to get they're just going to get killed unless you have an actual plan to get through this. I mean, just procreating itself isn't the answer. And oddly enough, the joke is the monks actually weren't procreating, but they came up with the answer. So, obviously somebody has to, because the monasteries wouldn't have any people in them. But it's just the fact that something so basic is sort of the talking point meta now means we're just so far gone. It's ridiculous. It's not even funny. We're just that far gone. So to sum it all up, what we need to do is first identify the meta of the meta, which is the deep magic and the deepest magic. These universal rules that apply throughout all of history, regardless of any of the contingent variables. Okay, number 1. 2, define the world that we're living in now, the technological society, which is going through a collapse of energy. And then 3, identify which trends can continue without high energy so that they will be operative in the future, and then just completely abandon those that are high energy. Now, a more fully nuanced position might mean you use what you have in the moment, so you kind of like ride you're basically riding along with it, but then you have to jump off before it collapses. So it's true. You can use some of these high energy tools as long as they're around, but don't fundamentally rely on them, because when they're gone, and you won't know how to deal with them. Okay, that's got to change. And then reading The Decline and Fall of the Empire by Gibbon, that's a lot of work. So maybe you just read Asimov's Foundation instead. Helps give you the mindset to do this. Obviously, to really hone the mindset, you have to read lots of history, or be taught those lessons by someone who has. That's probably the most convenient and time efficient way to do this. Also, reading Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings are also good examples of finding these core essential truths. Also, identifying that the Empire is dying, that wasting time on the Imperial core is a waste, and that you need to find some place away from all the action where you can do this. And why would you do that? Well, because if you're near all the action, you might get caught up and killed or destroyed. So whether you're Irish monks in Hibernia or the Foundationers in Terminus, you're so far away from the action that nobody really cares about you. So you get a long time to get the whole thing going before it's all over. So that is tonight's show. Let's see what we got in the chat. Hashim Awan, hello. GF, hello. Obadiah Vandal, hello. Imperator Forge, hello. GF, you made me think now. That's the whole point. GF, if the Union breaks and all states separate like the Roman Empire, West versus East, or its own version, does the Justinian way to reconquer do more damage? And how do you stop the cults that talk about dystopian part of Christianity, the American way, in case? So that might come from Mithra, blah, blah. Okay, so I guess Justinian meets Fallout, huh? Right. the Eastern Roman Empire continued intact. Now, will the United States completely, or the Western world in general, fragment completely, or will there be like centers of political power left over that try to reassert control? There could be the case, but it would do more damage. So for example, the classic fall of the Roman Empire is considered 476, where the last emperor is deposed by Odoacer. But I was watching this YouTuber, Moyoannis, who does late Roman history videos, and he argued that the real fall of the Western Empire was in 525 with the Gothic Wars between Justinian and the Ostrogoths, which destroyed Rome as a city. Because he argues that the Roman institutions, both cultural and religious, continued well into the 6th century, and that the Ostrogothic kingdom was seen as a vassal of the Eastern Roman Empire. Okay, somewhat controversial, I know, but he does correctly point out the destruction that Justinian's war did cause. Thing is, though, Italy was close to the core of the Eastern Roman Empire. It's not like, they attacked Hibernia or Britain, right? Though Vikings would do that later. And then the cults. Well, I think a lot of these cults are just going to burn themselves out. I mean, once in a while you get one that succeeds like the Mormons. But I think a lot of them will just burn out. So it's sort of like hold them at arm's length. Don't get too close and just let the whole fire burn low. GF. It's something else. Let's see. In seeing it in an organic way, organic or entropic way, may be that in reconstructing any type of order, the way it's rebuilt does not matter insofar as it just runs slightly better if compared to its predecessors. Well, I mean, I guess that depends on the goal that you want to set for yourself. Do you want to have a vision of a flourishing new society on the other side that you may not live to see, probably won't live to see, but you've done your part in setting it up? I mean, as Christians, that's sort of what we've all committed to, because we have to ensure that the church continues and is able to perform its mission in the future, which, if it does correctly, is like leaven, which leavens the whole loaf, which leavens society. But right now, the church is circling the drain and pretty much all over the world because they've basically sold out to global financial forces and to the machine. So it's going to be fragments that are on the other side of this. It's pretty rough, but I know it's been a lot to discuss, to try to digest. And this is a relatively new idea that I've been putting together over the last month or two. And, in future months and next year, I'll probably have a more fleshed out, more formalized position on this. But nonetheless, I think this is the beginning of an extremely important set of questions that need to be asked, and a very important set of what can be done, like what actually can be done. Because what we're seeing now is a kind of burnout on the right, where like, we tried everything, guys, it doesn't work. No, you tried everything that was stupid, everything that didn't work before, and doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, is the definition of insanity. What you didn't do were the things that do work, like the things that always work, that everybody used to know. Now, part of that's because many on the right are themselves a part of a deracinated digital civilization. Okay. But they're the ones also reading history. And it's disappointing that they don't seem to be able to learn the lessons of history. So, it's Ty Lewis, the Praise of Life podcast, signing off.